All right, we're going to get started. So if everyone could go around and introduce themselves to those people who may not know who you are. I know everyone who's on this call. Some of you I've known for a very, very long time, and some of you not as long. But I'll start out. My name is Brother Khalid Raheem. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I've been a community organizer and activist for several years. And I'm the founder and the chairperson for the New Afrikan Independence Party, which is an independent Black political party based on the traditions of groups and organizations such as the Black Panther Party, the Republican of Africa, SNCC, so forth and so on. I'm also the co-chair, the national co-chair for a group which is a political coalition, and that's called the National Black Radical Political Congress. And so we've been around for about the last 4 or 5 years. The New Afrikan Independence Party is part of that coalition, along with the National Black United Front, along with Ujima People's Progress Party based in Baltimore, Maryland, along with Operation Power based out of New York, along with several other groups, organizations, as well as individual members. So look us up, look up both the New Afrikan Independence Party as well as the National Black Radical Political Congress. Get involved in the movement, in the struggle to utilize electoral politics as a tool or vehicle in pursuit of Black liberation. We can't vote our way out of oppression, but we can certainly do what we need to do to bring some relief to our communities and families and different neighborhoods across the national Black community here within the United States. That being said, I know my introduction was rather long and lengthy, so we can start. Brother O, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
OTAP, Free the Land, Black Laws for Black People, by Black People. My name is Olawa Shekun. They call me Brother Shegun in the community. I've been conscious since a little type. My mother gave me Soul on Ice to read, I guess when I was 10 or 11. And she always tried to instill Black history in the home. One day I was out shooting dice, drinking wine, smoking cigarettes, and a brother came up to me and he said, came up to us, and he said, "Do you know who you are?" And we looked at each other. We said, "Yeah, we Black." He said, "No, we African." But back in them days, if you call somebody African, them was fighting words. So I went home and I told my mother, I said, "Mom, somebody outside said we was African." She looked out the window. She said, "Oh, that's Professor Wimpy Coachman from the University of Pittsburgh." She said, "Yeah, he's right. We are African." So to this day, I've been African. OTAP, free the land, all power to the people.
All right, thank you, Brother Shegun. I guess someone could step up. What about Brother Arnold?
Okay, my name is Arnold McWilliams. I've been a member of the New Afrikan Independence Party for about 6 or 7 years, and I found out that that both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, aren't doing anything for us. Especially the Democrats. I found that out a long time ago. And I currently live in the borough of North Braddock. That's in Pittsburgh, and trying to be activist. I've been an activist for a while. Even before I joined New Afrikan Independence Party.
All right, thank you, Brother Arnold. Sister Jennifer McPherson, if you could be next.
My name is Jennifer McPherson. I am an all-around activist. I do educational activism, housing activism, community activism, just anything that there's a need for, I step up. I'm doing a lot of political work, been working with the New Afrikan Independence Party for about between 6 to 8 years, I believe. and I'm living in Minnesota, where everything is just crazy. So yeah, that's me.
Oh yeah, Sister Jennifer, I know y'all got some real struggles out there with the uptick in political violence. So be careful and be vigilant. Okay, brother Marvin Parker, my guy, you're next. You want to introduce yourself? And I'm sorry, I should have introduced you by your Muslim name as well, but you could do the same, brother. We're going to give you a minute or so to connect. And if not, we're going to move on. All right, Sister Yasmin, you're next. You want to introduce yourself briefly? We'll come back to you as well. Sister Chandra? Oh, okay. All right, Chandra. Chandra says her mic doesn't work on the computer. She's introducing herself, Chandra from Pittsburgh. She's a member of the NAIP, New Afrikan Independence Party. She's been a member for several years. And I can say that Sister Chandra has done some very dynamic work within the criminal justice system, helping prisoners in Pennsylvania and other parts of the country. And a very old friend and comrade, Sister Tamika, if you could introduce yourself, if you're able to.
Grand Risings, good brothers and sisters. Yasmin told me about this about an hour ago. I didn't know anything about it, so I'm here to listen, learn, grow, and serve.
Oh, that's great. You're being very humble. I'm sure you can teach as well. So thank you very much. I'm glad you were able to get here along with Sister Yasmin. All right, so we want to start officially. I want to say thank you all. I'm glad you were able to take some time from your busy schedule. I know this is for many of us. We're in the middle of the Juneteenth celebrations, and I know that after this particular class and session is over, many people will be headed out to participate in their community-based Juneteenth celebration activities, no matter where you happen to live. And I think we need to say something about Juneteenth as well, but we'll wait until after the formal presentation. And we probably need to share some comments amongst all of us about what's happening throughout the world, not just within the African diaspora, but what's happening throughout so-called Middle East, as well as Asia, specifically the Western part of Asia. There's a lot of things happening that could impact all of us here within the United States. So let's get going. And I'm going to do a share screen. And I think all of you are familiar with what that means. So just give me a second here, and we're going to start going through this officially. Okay. All right, you should be able to see the share screen at this point. Can everyone see it? Just if someone could speak up.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I assume that includes everyone. I'm going to try to do the slide, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So if you could just bear with us for one moment. Can you see a share screen, a singular big screen now, Brother Arnold?
Yes.
Okay.
No, it's not. It's not on there.
It's not on. It's not coming through.
No, it's not coming to the big screen. No.
Okay, so it's still the same as it was.
Still the same as it was from slave revolts to anti-lynching to the anti-lynching movement.
And then you have the panels to the left of the screen. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
All right, so we're going to go with that format. It's a little bit more difficult. I'm going to try to make this a little larger for folks. Just give me a moment. All right. Well, this might be the best that I can do right now. I'll try to make some adjustments if I can. And I'm going to read off some things as well. I'm going to provide a lot of narration. And at different times, we're going to stop and ask people if they have any questions or comments, or if they'd like to make some additional commentary or share some information and knowledge. Because we have a lot of people here who are very knowledgeable, who have a lot of experience in terms of community organizing and activism as well. So from time to time, we're going to ask any of you if you want to make some contributions or make some additions to the actual presentation. All right, so now let's go over the content for this afternoon. We're going to talk about slave revolts in general. We're going to look at not just the slave revolts, we're going to look at how the national Black community became a national Black community, how over a process of several years, groups of enslaved Africans, having gone through the process of enslavement, really having gone through the process of capture, enslavement, resistance, how as a group we started to develop a certain type of consciousness about ourselves, and how we started to develop a certain type of politics about ourselves, and how it's connected to who we are today. So the content, we're going to start with the slave revolts. We're going to go over some basic information about different slave revolts. Then we're going to get into group reliance and self-improvement. There was a period where that was very important amongst those Black folks who had managed to escape slavery, and those who had never been slaves, who had been freed men and freed women in different places throughout the North in particular. Then we're going to talk about the repatriation movement, the movement to repatriate or to have enslaved Blacks and freed Blacks returned back to Africa or some other area, but not within the United States of America. Then we're going to talk about the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad, which I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with. We talk about the development of the Civil War, the aftermath of the Civil War, the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, talk about Black Reconstruction. And then we're going to end up talking about Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching movement. You can throw in any local connections and movements that you may be familiar with in your particular city, state, or area. And then we have a set of recommended readings that you may want to look into to enhance your understanding or to enhance your knowledge. So that being said, let's start with slave revolts. I assume everyone can see the content, what I just recited, what I just went over.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're moving on to the next section. Slave revolts. There were over 300 documented slave revolts or rebellions in North America and the Caribbean islands. The most famous is probably the one that occurred in what we now call Haiti. The Haitian Rebellion or the Haitian Revolution, 1791, culminated in 1804. And the reason that's so significant for a lot of reasons is that the Haitian Revolution represented actually the first successful slave revolt and revolution against slave owners and against colonial powers, namely France. And it set the stage, and some people would argue that it inspired other successive revolts, and it also created fear amongst the slaveholder class here within the United States and throughout the Western Hemisphere. Because when they got the word about what happened in Haiti and how successful it was, and how the captured, or rather the enslaved Africans had managed to organize amongst themselves, and they had managed to free themselves from enslavement. They killed their slave masters. They took over the country. They established some type of system, and they basically started to create their own nation state. And so this sent shockwaves and shivers throughout the Western Hemisphere and throughout Europe, as a matter of fact, because remember, these are the days when the European powers were really deep into not just imperialism, but colonialism, and utilizing the African slave trade as a foundation for the economic development and economic growth. So we deal with the Haitian Revolution. Gabriel Prosser and the slave revolt in Richmond, Virginia in 1800 was very significant as well. Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina. And by the way, South Carolina, someone can contribute if you know. I don't remember exactly the port, but South Carolina was a major area from which enslaved or captured Africans were actually introduced into the United States slave system. A lot of people came through South Carolina. A lot of us come from and through South Carolina. As a matter of fact, within my family, on my mother's side, we are South Carolinians. A lot of us come from there. My mother was one of about 19 or 20 children. And so they grew up, they came through South Carolina, and then from South Carolina, they migrated from the South, like many of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did. They migrated from the South, and they wound up in places in the Mid-Atlantic area, up in New York, in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and I wound up in Pittsburgh. I took the long route, and that's a whole different discussion. But yeah, so a lot of captured Africans, I try to hesitate and not say enslaved Africans, because at that point they were not enslaved, they were captured, they had been captured. And they were going through the process of becoming slaves, because they had to make our people into slaves. Our people didn't volunteer to be slaves, and being a slave was in our original job or our original definition. It wasn't how we defined ourselves. The Europeans didn't come across slaves, they came across Africans, and those Africans were first captured, and then those Africans were enslaved. And that enslavement was a process. It didn't happen automatically, didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of resistance. And even after our people had been enslaved, as we're talking about now, there were several rebellions and there were several revolts against slavery, against the institution, and against the whole process within itself. So Gabriel Prosser, Richmond, Virginia, 1800, Denmark, Vesey, Charleston, South Carolina, 1822. Nat Turner, many of us are familiar with the story of Nat Turner, Southampton, Virginia, 1831. Then there's the Amistad Rebellion. Some of us may know about that. There was a motion picture made about Nat Turner's rebellion, as well as the Amistad Rebellion in 1839, where the brothers and sisters rebelled. They were on the slave ship and they took it over. The Maroons, South Carolina Islands, and Jamaica and Puerto Rico. These were the people who fought against slavery, and they actually were able to set up encampments, or they joined with other people like indigenous people, with white people who had been enslaved as well. Many had been like indentured servants. They joined with those forces, and they became known as the Maroons. The Seminole Wars in Florida, three wars, actually with three, 1817 to 1842, where enslaved Africans in their fight for freedom joined up with the indigenous Seminole Indian tribes. And they fought multiple wars, three wars that we know of, from 1817 to 1842. And then there were multiple revolts all throughout South America, many of which I dare not even attempt to name. But let's go back to slave revolts. We want to stop here just for a moment. Is there anyone who would like to add some additional information to what we presented so far in terms of slave revolts?
Well, that fort was Fort Monroe. Was it Fort Monroe in Virginia?
Fort Monroe. I'm not familiar with that. Okay, but go
Okay.
ahead, share.
Yeah, yeah. They said, well, Fort Monroe, and I guess it was Fort. They said Port Comfort. Yeah, Port Comfort. It's now known as Fort Monroe.
Okay, okay, but what was the previous name?
Uh, that was uh Port Port Comfort.
Port Comfort.
Yes.
Okay, all right, and now known as Fort Monroe.
Yeah, Fort Monroe. That was the primary port in Virginia.
Okay, so that was in Virginia. Okay. Any other comments? Any other additions? Okay, and I want to welcome anyone else who's joined in. I think someone else did join in. I want to welcome. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing your time with us this afternoon. All right, so now we're going to move away from slave revolts. In the next section, we're going to talk about is the group reliance in the self-improvement phase. So, now enslaved Africans and those who were able to escape slavery and those who had never been slaves. They had been so-called freedmen and freedwomen in the northern parts, some of the states and colonies that were much more liberal, or you may say much more progressive in how they dealt with slavery. Pennsylvania having been one of those colonies and one of those states at some point. Absalom Jones, 1746 to 1818. He was born into slavery. He purchased freedom for his wife and then himself, and he established the first Black Episcopal. He was the first Black Episcopal priest. He was an early abolitionist. And then many of us know about Richard Allen and Absalom Jones together, many of us from the state of Pennsylvania, especially the Philadelphia area. Richard Allen, 1760 to 1831, he founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME, early abolitionists, also part of the Underground Railroad they helped to develop. Along with others, they walked out doing church services and protests against forced segregation. Then there was the Free Africa Society. It was set up and developed to provide mutual aid to newly freed slaves in Philadelphia. And our people then, as now, I talked about earlier, the National Black Radical Political Convention. We have something scheduled for October of this year. But what we're doing is in the same tradition as the early Negro Convention movement that was established in different places, especially throughout the North. These were opportunities and these were exercises in Black people organizing amongst themselves, coming together to talk about the issues, but more so to lay out strategy and to gather resources so they could improve the condition of newly freed slaves, those who have been able to escape slavery, those who were trying to adjust to the new environment. That's what this was all about. And also using whatever political power or leverage they had, which was very little, but to use whatever they had in cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and perhaps places throughout New York, to use whatever political leverage they had to be advocates on behalf of their brothers and sisters who were still bound up in slavery, especially throughout the mid-Atlantic states and throughout the South. So we get the Negro Convention movement. So these are all things that really emanate from our spiritual side, right? A lot of this sounds political, and it really was, but a lot of this political activism, a lot of this social activism was rooted in our people's spirituality. And we could talk about it being rooted in our African spirituality and how that African spirituality, even though it was contained and captured and enslaved, it still found manifestations throughout the Black church itself. And so you see that with Absalom Jones, with Richard Allen, with others, the Free African Society, the Negro Convention movement. All this stuff is really rooted in the spirituality and in the faith of Black people. I caution a lot of activists today radicals and revolutionaries. And I don't take anything away from anyone who calls themselves that, or who promotes that. I promote it as well. But I always caution the radicals, the revolutionaries, even the so-called progressives today, especially within the Black group, within the Black circle, who denounce religion, or who are hypercritical of our brothers and sisters who go to church, or who go to the mosque, or who go to the temple, or who pray, because we sometimes forget that that was the root, that was the foundation of all of our activism. That was the root, that was the foundation of our resistance, whether it was the physical resistance, whether it was military resistance, whether it was sometimes a silent non-compliance, that type of resistance, right? At the core of a lot of it was our belief and our faith. And a lot of us today, I believe, are manifestations of that. I remind people that it's likely that some enslaved African 200, 300, 400 years ago prayed for us, prayed that we would be who we are today, prayed that a people like us would be around. Some of them prayed in a very vengeful way, and some of them prayed in probably a much more universal way. When I say prayed in a vengeful way, I can relate to that. I know there was some times I used to pray that we just kill these people, right? But I think we had some ancestors who prayed for that. I think we had some ancestors who prayed that, we could reconcile and we could all live better lives. I think we had some ancestors who prayed that we would one day be able to establish our own nation and be free. I think we had ancestors who prayed for us to be able to return back to the continent of Africa from which we came. So many of us today, I believe, this is just my personal belief, are actually a manifestation of a lot of our ancestral prayers and desires, and hopes and wishes. And so we should never discount that, because I think, in all faiths, we believe that whatever the divine creator is, he, she, they, us, we, that they listen to the prayers of the most oppressed and exploited. And they listen to those prayers and they honor those prayers. And so I think we need to be mindful of that. But moving on, that's just my little personal dialogue about it. So now, let's move to the next slide, if I may. I'm kind of struggling here a little bit. All right. So now we talk about the repatriation movement. Again, it was religious motivation, it was economic and political motivation as well. I mentioned a lot of the religious motivation in our people's struggle historically, the spiritual religious motivation. But there were economic and there was political motivation specifically regarding the repatriation movement. Repatriation means basically to go back to where you came from, or to seek to understand where you come from, and then to go back to that area, right? And so there was a repatriation movement, and for some forces within the United States of America, that movement was supported only because they saw it as a solution to the so-called Negro problem. That when I say the Negro problem, well, I shouldn't say the Negro problem. I think it's probably unfair to characterize it that way. I'm using a phrase that became popular in the 20th century, especially in the second half of the 20th century. But we're talking about the 19th century. And at this particular juncture, it would not have been a Negro problem. It would have been the problem of slavery. It would have been the problem of how to deal with the call for abolition. It would have been a problem that would have been framed in terms of as the United States of America was expanding from the 13 colonies on the East Coast and expanding westwardly and conquering and subjugating the indigenous people and stealing their land. whether those areas should enter the so-called Union as free states or slave states. So that's the way it would have been framed in the 19th century, right? So it wasn't a Negro problem. It was an issue of slavery and the westward expansion of the United States of America. So we get the creation of what's called the American Colonization Society. And then we see repatriation or moving back to different places in Africa. We see it being played out in areas throughout Africa, like Sierra Leone. We may not be that familiar with it. Liberia, particularly Liberia. Many of us are familiar with the situation with Liberia, how in the 19th century, as part of the repatriation movement, some Blacks opted to, and then some Blacks were just forced to go to Liberia, right? The Liberia became this place that would house those Blacks who had been former slaves, or those Blacks who were freedmen and freed women. They had a choice to go to Liberia and to set up some type of colony there. Now that created all types of conflict, because with the indigenous Africans who already lived in that area, that wasn't called Liberia at that time. I don't remember what the area was called, by the indigenous brothers and sisters who lived there. But that created some conflict, not just cultural conflict, but political conflict as well, and class conflict. You know how we can be as Black people. Malcolm described it best. He said the house Negro and the field Negro. So imagine if you are a Black person here within the United States and you decide you want to repatriate to Africa, and the United States government says, okay, you can go to this place we call Liberia, which, by the way, the capital of this place called Liberia, we're going to name it after one of the presidents of the United States at that time, or around that era, James Monroe. So the capital is going to be Monrovia, which, by the way, James Monroe was a slave master. So so you can go to Liberia, you can live in the capital, named after a U.S. president / slave master, and that's where you need to be. So how do you think the brothers and sisters who were indigenous to that area, how do you think they took that? Some may have said, okay, welcome back home. But you know how we can be as Black people, even today in the 21st century. If some of us who have a little bit more than others, we can get real arrogant, and we can start to look down our nose at our own brothers and sisters about what they don't have relative to what we do have, or what we think we have, right? And so I would imagine that caused some social conflict, some political conflict, and class conflict, probably very similar to some of the class conflict we see today within the national Black community, because we do have a national Black bourgeoisie now, right? It's not just a Black middle class. We have a national Black bourgeoisie that is firmly, strongly embedded in our culture, in our politics, and in our civil society. And many of them don't realize it, but many of them actually work against the collective best interests of the Black community. So that's just something I guess we can get off into a little later on as we have these political education classes and sessions. But imagine how the indigenous Africans may have received those brothers and sisters who were repatriating back to places in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Some of it was probably positive, and some of it probably wasn't that positive. And then we get the post-Reconstruction repatriation. So this is after the failures of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction happened after the Civil War, but so Reconstruction has failed. So the post-Reconstruction repatriation, where brothers and sisters here, former slaves, enslaved people, and freed women as well, those who had never been slaves, those who had escaped slavery or paid their way out of slavery. Those people decided, like, I had enough of the United States, I'm out of here. And so you had the post-Reconstruction repatriation, where those brothers and sisters moved. They left the United States. They went to places in Europe. They moved to places throughout the African continent. They got up and got on out of here. Wasn't a lot, but they left. And some of them were pushed out because you had races within the U.S. government who were orchestrating U.S. public policy, and they supported post-Reconstruction repatriation. Like, yeah, man, you know, get them Negroes out of here. We don't need them. They free from slavery. Get them on out of here, right? So there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of apprehension on the part of those reactionary racist white supremacist forces about Black people who now were free, so to speak, to move about. They were free to engage in political activity and economic activity, not without repercussions. We all know that, as we get the rise of the KKK. But they had a relative freedom that they had not enjoyed under the years of chattel slavery. I want to stop here and take any comments, anything that people would like to add to the narrative so far.
Yeah, I'd like to interject some, Brother Khalid, and
Yes, sir.
if I can. This here repatriation movement, a lot of it seems to be based on education. If you were educated, you had more clout than those that were uneducated. So you were put in leadership positions to lead. And if the leaders say, let's go, what you gonna do but go?
Okay.
That in. You know, it's the same thing today. Like you said, with the bourgeoisie, the upper class, the highly educated, the influential, those that have success, their positions as our leaders, especially in this town, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the Allegheny County area, everything stays the same and nothing really changes. That's why it's so important. We have this new African Independent Political Party. It's of the utmost importance. And also,
yeah. Thank you very much, brother. I appreciate that comment. You're absolutely right. Never thought about the class influence at that particular time in the 19th century. And we have even stronger class influence now in the 21st century. When I say class influence, I'm talking about the influence of, just as you said, brother, the influence of people within our own group who have a little bit more money, a little bit more influence, i.e. a little bit more power. And what that can do in terms of shaping the group politic and shaping the group culture and moving the group in a certain direction, as opposed to directions that might be more advantageous for us as a group. But that's a discussion I'm sure we're going to come back to over and over and over again as we explore and look at our political development in the 20th century and where we are in the 21st century. And I'd like to remind those of us from the Pittsburgh, Allegheny County area, we currently have a Black mayor, Mayor Ed Gainey, Brother Ed Gainey, who is on his way out of office after only serving one term. He's only been in office 4 years. He did not get the support of the Democratic Party, right? And if you think about the time in which Ed Gainey was elected, it was a very tumultuous time, right? There was a lot of pushback because of the murder of George Floyd, murders of Breonna Taylor. There was tremendous upheaval, not just in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, but throughout the country and around the world. People witnessed, in particular the case with George Floyd, they witnessed this man get choked to death, strangled to death, suffocated on national TV. So there was no dispute about the racism and about the murderous behavior of the police. So that set off a storm of things. Plus, we were dealing with COVID at that time too. And so you get that whole confluence of anger of outrage, of disappointment, and you get this big movement. And, you know, some people designated it as the Black Lives Matter movement, but it was bigger than Black Lives Matter. Long story short, again, he got into the mayoral seat based on a lot of their energy. And that energy raised a lot of consciousness. And I would argue that it tilted the white community into being more sympathetic and to being more open to perhaps having a Black chief executive for the city of Pittsburgh. Once that subsided, then it got back to business as usual in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. And, you know, when we look at history, we see those tendencies over and over again, not just Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, but we see those historical tendencies over and over again. We see these tendencies of how the system, and when I say the system, I'm talking about the system of white supremacy, economic injustice and exploitation called capitalism at home, and imperialism abroad. We see how that system collectively pushes back against any progress, against any social change that may have been orchestrated or made beforehand, whether it's the civil rights movement and then the pushback against the civil rights movement, whether it's what we recently saw with the Black Lives Matter phenomenon and the march and protests around the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And now we're living in an era of pushback, right? And the era of pushback we live in is kind of symbolized by the Trump administration. But it could have been Donald Trump in office, and really before Donald Trump, it was Joe Biden. For real, when you really think about it and just kind of take off the blinders, it was Joe Biden. And even before him, in many ways, it could have been Barack Obama, who they call what? The deporter in chief, who deported more people out of this country than Trump has so far. Trump may exceed Obama, but so far, Obama was the real deporter in chief. And then you look at Joe Biden. It was Joe Biden during his administration that started to suppress student protests and unrest, right? So we get these pushback moments. We talked about the Reagan Revolution. Part of the Reagan Revolution was a pushback against the progress that had been made during the civil rights movement and during the early years of the Black Power movement. And then we talk about the Black Liberation movement. It was suppressed and criminalized. I can personally testify to that. And there's a couple of people on this call who can personally testify to how the Black Liberation movement specifically was just crushed and suppressed, not crushed completely, but, you know, it became criminal if you were a member of the Black Panther Party, or you became associated with the Black Liberation Army, if you were part of the Congress of African People. I'm talking about things that just became criminalized. And if it wasn't officially criminalized, then it became known that if you were associated with those groups, you know, you couldn't get a job, you couldn't get a loan, you couldn't get a grant to do certain things. I mean, it just, that's how it was. And that was the pushback. And so we're living in an era now, if not just pushback, we're talking about the dismantling of some of the fundamental things that people had taken for granted. Voting rights, the right to freedom of speech, the right to assemble, the right to protest, due process. A lot of stuff is just being completely undermined and dismantled. But it's in this era of pushback. And I think Agani is part of what is happening. He's part of that pushback politically. And that's not to say that, you know, I supported him completely and that we should support him completely or whatever, but I think we need to look at this objectively in terms of what is going on. And you see it happening all around this country, that especially in those cities where they have a Democratic Party mayors, whether those Democrats have been progressive, whether they've been reactionary, they're being attacked. And we need to look at that and examine that, because again, this is not the first time this has happened. It's happened before. It happened in the early part of the 20th century. A lot of you don't realize that in the early part of the 20th century, socialism was very popular. Socialism was very popular. And I think you had like the Socialist Party, Communist Party, some other groups, socialist workers. they had actually won electoral power in many municipalities and cities across this country. So in many cities and in many municipalities, you had socialists who were actually the mayors, the city managers. And then there was the pushback against that. And not only were they removed, but the history was erased. You got to dig deep to find that. So I would encourage us all to dig a little deep to look into that. But now let's go back to the 19th century and let's look at post-Reconstruction repatriation. Again, this is after the failure, the downfall of Reconstruction. And I shouldn't say that Reconstruction failed. Reconstruction was gutted. And we can talk about that a little later on, and we are going to talk about that. So anything else that people would like to add as we move on?
Someone wanted to add that Ed Gainey actually said something. The sad thing, he said something about free Gaza, you know, and people, the other people I know, there's a Jewish community here in Pittsburgh called Squirrel Hill, and he mostly lost. You know, I don't think he got many votes in Squirrel Hill after he said that. You know, because people they're still supporting Israel, even though Israel is killing innocent people. You know, I mean, it's really sad. You know, and I think he lost in you know, the outlying areas too, because you know, you know, anytime they put, you know, there's a district attorney here that a lot of people hate, and his name is Steven Zappala. And I think he lost in the outlying areas too, you know.
Okay, it's a good observation. Good observation. You're right. I didn't even talk about the foreign policy issues, and you're right. You're right. For those people who don't support Israel, those people who stand with the Palestinian and who speak out strongly against the genocide in Gaza and the developing genocide in the West Bank as well. If you speak out against that, then you get ostracized, you get targeted by groups like the AIPAC, right? The American Israeli Public Affairs Committee or Commission, whatever it's called. And they just like go after you. If you're like a incumbent politician or public official, they go after you. They try to find someone who can run against you, and they fund your opposition if you're campaigning to get into office and you're not pro-Israeli. Then they will find someone to run against you to make sure you never get in office. I mean, they're very vicious, very calculated, and they're very strategic. We don't want to be vicious. We do want to be calculated. We should always be strategic in how we move as well. So let's move on here. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Somebody has something else to say?
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah, please.
All right. So, yeah, just on what you were saying about, you know, it looks like Trump, but then it could be this person, that person, that person. So my observation, and I could be absolutely wrong, is, you know, back in 2016 when Trump was running, he said his whole purpose was to expose the corruption. And a lot of people are like, well, Trump is corrupt too, but it's like he's willing to give himself up to expose it. Like, I don't know if anybody is catching it, but it seems like everything that he's doing is being challenged by the courts. And then some stuff is coming out in his favor, and people are like, well, how could that possibly be? But if you think about it, we're not really learning about how the government truly works in school. Like, they used to teach about it, but I graduated in 2000, and I ain't heard nobody after me talk about any classes being.
Well, I mean, hopefully, as we have more discussions and more political education and community organizing sessions, we can learn more about how government really, really works. And I agree with you. I mean, fundamentally, there's two things going on. Number one, Trump represents a segment within the US ruling class. A segment. He represents a certain way of thinking within the US ruling class. They all are part of the same ruling class. So let's not get it twisted. What we see happening between the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party on the national level and even on the local level is an internal struggle. It's not an internal struggle, and I've written about this in I think in Toward a New African Revolution, Volume 2. It's not an internal struggle to decide whether the system of white supremacy, capitalism, and imperialism should be dismantled. That's not what this struggle is about. So the Democratic Party, talking about the National Democratic Party, the way they use the Black community is they come up with a line that pushes a threat that if you don't vote straight Democrat somehow or another, right, you're going to be back in the picking cotton again, right?
Historically speaking, as a Pittsburgher, brother, I want to kind of rewind back to a remark made about education related to leadership in our city of Pittsburgh. I'm not going national, just local. There was a time when a college educated attorney wanted to run to be city of Pittsburgh mayor, Bird Brown. He lost to a nice little lady, Jewish lady from Squirrel Hill. If you look at this present situation, the police state that's developing, I know here in the city of Pittsburgh that the Fraternal Order of Police basically runs everything. People toss around the man's name, Zapala, but he's just representative of a group, of thinking type of a group that police state and just bullying and pushing around education is not necessarily important to that group of Pittsburghers of who they want to see in the position of quote unquote leadership or quote unquote power. So it was my honor to see a man of color become a mayor in this city. As a matter of fact, he wasn't supported by the Democratic. He first stepped into politics. He wanted he wanted to run for Representative Joe Preston's seat. And some Democratic committee or something wouldn't support him. My mother and I personally encouraged him, told him, if you want to run, run. There's a segment of people in the city that will support you. He won that election and worked in Harrisburg. And it was the same thing with him wanting to be the mayor. But in my heart of hearts, I always knew that was going to be a temporary and very probably much so manipulated situation. The city of Pittsburgh just isn't making itself ready for that progressive thinking. They want to stick to the old line politics. That's just my opinion. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think your opinion is very much on point. I was slightly different though in terms of the power within the city that some of us don't see. The power is the same type of power that runs the country. Someone had spoke earlier about Squirrel Hill, the Squirrel Hill community. So let's be clear, all Jews are not Zionists. As a matter of fact, all Zionists are not Jewish, right? But we do have a strong faction of people within the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County who are Zionists and who support Israel, who support Zionism, right? Who are racist, who may smile and pat Black folks on the back, might even give you a check or two, but who don't really want to see Black people have any degree of self-determination or power. So I think your comments are well taken. When we talk about the Fraternal Order of Police, the new Afrikan Independence Party, for example, over 10 years ago, we launched a mobilization against the FOP. If you recall,
Yes.
when the FOP had its 100th anniversary here in Pittsburgh, we were the ones
Yes.
who organized that protest. Nobody else. People thought we were crazy, but we hit the street. And eventually other people joined in. We hit the street. We had workshops. We had discussions about it. We mobilized people from the Hill District. We marched from the Hill District to downtown. Then we had protests in front of hotels and motels where they were having their convention. We let them know you were not welcome here, right? And especially, I think this was on the heels of the murder of Mike Brown up in Ferguson, Missouri. We said, how dare you come to Pittsburgh? But when you look at the history, the FOP was founded where? In Pittsburgh.
Yes.
You see, the FOP was founded here in Pittsburgh by a couple of local Pittsburgh police officers. If you check out the FOP's website, Lodge number 1, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Right now, its national headquarters is in Washington, D.C. Today, why? because as you all know, you want to be part of that lobbying crew. You want to make sure you got an office in Washington, D.C. So it's right in Washington, D.C., along with all the other lobbyists who, woo and who move our so-called public officials to do their bidding as opposed to representing their particular constituencies and communities. But I agree with you, sister. Pittsburgh is very unique. We should never forget that while every other major and not so major city around us had already had a Black mayor, this the first time we ever had one. Everybody else around us then had 2, sometimes 3 or 4 Black mayors by now, since the latter part of the 20th century. New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Newark, New Jersey, all these other cities around Pittsburgh had already had a Black mayor. It took us well into the 21st century to finally get one. So you're absolutely correct. But looking at the struggle on a national level and the international level, we're looking at the ruling class. So let's just talk about here with the United States to keep it simple. The ruling class within the United States politically, in terms of the political parties, Democrats versus Republicans, Republicans versus Democrats. Their struggle is not about dismantling the system. So the Democratic Party has a lot of us thinking that they're fighting for us to change the system. No, they're not. The struggle between the Democrats and Republicans is about how to best manage the system, not to fundamentally change it or dismantle it. Don't be fooled. The Democratic Party is not fighting to dismantle capitalism. The Democratic Party is not fighting to dismantle imperialism. If you don't believe me, look at the voting records of most people in the U.S. Congress, House of Representatives, and the U.S. Senate. Look at their voting records when it comes to Israel. Look at their voting records when it comes to going to war against that country. Look at their voting records when it comes to funding different military expenditures and budgets. So they're basically on the same page as the Republican Party. So you do have some variations. You have some Democrats who are anti-war. They're not Zionists, and we salute those Democrats, and we should support them as much as we possibly can on those particular type of issues. You have some Republicans who take the same position. Like you got people within Trump's Republican Party right now, they're pushing back against Trump about fighting against Iran, right? And about always supporting Israel. Well, it's not just like the US always supporting Israel. It does look like the tail wagging the dog, but actually it isn't the tail wagging the dog. Israel is doing the bidding of the United States of America. The United States can't just forcefully come out at this point. It may later on within the next week or two, but Israel has been the attack dog for the United States throughout the Middle East to make sure that US interests, i.e. corporate interests, are always well represented and protected and safeguarded. So again, we look at the ruling class. United States of America is like, you have different factions within the ruling class. Politically, it's 2 big groups, Democrats on one side, Republicans. And then you got variations of their politics. You got moderate Republicans, you got moderate Democrats. You got liberal and you got progressive Democrats. You got conservative Republicans. You got fiscal conservatives. You got constitutionalist people, right? So you got all types of variations, but the bottom line is the ruling class. And now we have to figure out how we're going to navigate the situation that we're in as Black people, not just Black people in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, but as Black people from coast to coast, from north to south. See, our mistake is that we oftentimes don't see ourselves as a nation, but our enemies do. Our enemies and adversaries see us as a nation. They see us as an internal threat, as an existential threat, to be quite honest with you. And they do everything they can to mitigate that threat, to control that threat. They don't want to get into out and out war, right? But they've came up with different ways. And one of the things they came up with is to create a buffer class a class of Black people who can be a buffer between the ruling class and the majority of Black people who are just regular workers or unemployed and so forth and so on, right? And so they created this buffer, and this buffer protects the ruling class from our anger and from our displeasure and from any direct violence, right? And so if you start to see it like that, you come up with a different analysis. If you look at how the United States operates globally, they do the same thing all around the world that they've done with us, right? Divide and conquer, create buffer classes, support this, don't support that, destroy your community, completely destroy your community so it's incapable of coming back again to pose any serious challenge. Same thing they do with nations, completely destroy the infrastructure, destroy the nation state apparatus of a Libya, right? Of a Iraq, destroy it completely. And then when you destroy it, people are scrambling, trying to survive. And then that's when you get the rise of criminal elements. That's when you get the rise of elements that don't necessarily have the best interests of the collective. And then you support some of those elements against each other. And then whatever resources that particular nation state may have had, then you take control over it through your corporations, through your nonprofits. And it's the same thing they've done with us within this country. But many of us don't see it like that because we're so divided in our thinking. We look at only Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, Philadelphia, Delaware County, LA, Los Angeles County, Detroit, Michigan, that county, so we look at things that way instead of saying, hold it. What about all of us? We 45 to 50 million strong right now. We're not like 400,000 newly freed Africans coming out of slavery. We are a substantial powerhouse within the United States of America, if we choose to be. But right now, we're like we're almost like a vassal state that's not quite a state. We're a colony. We're an internal colony. And I think that Sister Tamika, she can relate to that idea because that's something that we all learned over 40, 50 years ago, right? So I want to move on now. Some good discussion, some very good comments, especially what you said about Brother Ed Gainey and what's happening here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. So we get the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. The early abolitionists, again, were religious. They were inspired based on their religious beliefs as well as their motivations. They sought an immediate end to slavery and full emancipation. Now, I just want to emphasize that these were the early abolitionists, and some of them throughout the years maintained the same type of religious inspirations and motivations. But it didn't remain that way for all of the abolitionists. Some of the abolitionists were just political, economic, and pragmatic. They wanted to end slavery because an enslaved labor force was in competition with an emerging, basically European working class. And some didn't want that to happen. They favored this emerging European working class. And they wanted that European working class to, be able to reap the full benefits of their labor. And they couldn't reap the full benefits of their labor. They were always in competition with an enslaved working class, right? That had no type of liberal freedom to demand anything, right? So they said, nah, we can't compete with economies that utilize absolutely free labor. So we got to get rid of that. So later on, that became the motivation for some of the abolitionists. And in the early years, the abolitionists, many of them, they sought an immediate end to slavery and full emancipation. But as the years went by, that changed with some of the abolitionists too. So we need to be clear about this. All the abolitionists were not the same. You had some abolitionists who favored a gradual reduction of slavery. You had some abolitionists who said, okay, we can have a reduction of slavery here, but as we move westward, the territories and states need to decide for themselves. And then some said, hell no. As we expand, every state needs to be a free state, right? No slavery. So you had these conflicts going on. You had the emergence and the development of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And then we have these figures that we all should know about, or we've heard of, like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and the great John Brown, who was white, right? Who came out as abolitionists, who said slavery needs to end. He said it for religious reasons. He said it for political reasons. He said slavery needs to end immediately, and slavery is an abomination, and we need to take up arms to fight against it. And he enlisted his sons. You know, he literally put he put his money where his mouth was. He enlisted his family. He enlisted other freedmen, freed women. He enlisted people who had escaped from slavery, and he called upon Frederick Douglass as well. And you know, he wanted Frederick Douglass to be part of that. Frederick Douglass declined, but even after Harper's Ferry and what happened there when John Brown was eventually captured and he was executed, Frederick Douglass was still hounded and persecuted by the U.S. government. I think he sought political refuge. He was a political refugee in Europe. He had to hide out in Europe for a while because they had associated him with John Brown's rebellion. I'm going to stop there. Any comments as we move on? Okay.
Yeah,
so,
I wanted to say
yeah.
something about Thaddeus Stevens. He wasn't a real outgoing abolitionist, was he?
From what I understand, he was. Thaddeus Stevens was a very outgoing abolitionist. Thaddeus Stevens, I can't remember the other gentleman with him. I think he was from Massachusetts. I think it was Charles Sumner. But Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens were part of what was called the radical Republicans within Congress. They were the ones who advocated that the newly freed slaves not just be given political freedom, but that they be given an economic basis as well. Like they supported 40 acres and a mule. So, you know, you had the Republicans who, for the most part, were abolitionists, but within the Republican Party at that time, you had the radical Republicans and Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. I think somebody could look it up. I think it was Charles Sumner from out of Massachusetts. But Thaddeus Stevens, by the way, was the congressperson from Pennsylvania. That's why if you travel around the state of Pennsylvania and you go to Philly and Pittsburgh and every place, all the places in between, you go throughout the Black community, you're going to find some school, some building named after Thaddeus Stevens.
So yeah. It was Charles Sumner.
Right. Okay. There we go. And then we know about the Underground Railroad. And then we know that one of the laws that kind of lit the straw to the fire as far as the Civil War was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. All right, so now this, because we're running short on time and I really want to get through this. This has been some great conversation. Let's talk about the Civil War itself. Now, hindsight is always 2020. So if we had a chance, like if we could be transported back into the past and look at the so-called founding fathers and look at what was to become the United States of America, they said we could transport ourselves back to 1789 when the Constitution was first ratified, for 1789, between 1789 and 1790. And we looked at the different people and where they came from who were going to constitute this new nation to be called the United States of America. And we looked at where they came from. We looked at their means of production, their mode of production, right? Then we could predict it then like, dude, you guys gonna have some trouble amongst yourself if you don't resolve your issue around your means and your mode of production, i.e. slavery. If you don't resolve the slavery issue, you guys gonna have a lot of trouble, and not from outsiders, you're gonna be fighting amongst yourself. So we could do a time travel, we could have seen in 1789 and 1790 that it was gonna be some static. If you look at the beginning of what was to become the United States of America, the first 5 presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. Out of the first 5 presidents, only one came from the North. That was the second, John Adams. He came from the state of Massachusetts. All the other 4 all came from one state. They came from the state of Virginia. They all were slave masters: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. So the beginning of the United States was problematic. Let's not even talk about how it became the United States. Let's not talk about the inherent hypocrisy of these group of so-called revolutionaries demanding their freedom, because it technically, and this may sound strange to hear, but the US Revolution was an anti-colonial struggle. It was an anti-colonial struggle, much in the same way that we saw anti-colonial struggles throughout the African diaspora in Central South America and throughout Asia, much like the anti-colonial struggles of Kenya against Britain, the anti-colonial struggles of Libya against Italy, the anti-colonial struggles of places in West Africa against the French and the British, the anti-colonial struggles of, say, the Central African areas against the Portuguese and against the British, the French, and the Belgians. It was an anti-colonial struggle, because these 13 colonies no longer wanted to be colonies of so-called Great Britain. And it was an anti-colonial struggle. But the inherent contradiction and hypocrisy of their anti-colonial struggle is that at the same time that they were advocating and fighting to free themselves from British colonialism, they maintained African slaves, and they committed genocide against indigenous people to acquire the land to begin with. So it was all these inherent contradictions, right? Even as they were sitting down to ratify this Constitution of 1789 or 1790. And you had the contradiction amongst themselves, because one group, namely the Mid-Atlantic and like the Northern, what we call like the New England group, and even some of the Mid-Atlantic states were still engaged in slavery. Maryland was still in, matter of fact, Maryland didn't declare slavery had ended well after the Civil War had ended. A lot of people don't realize this. Maryland was still a slave state well after 1865, right? But, you know, so some of the Mid-Atlantic states were still holding on to the slavery thing and practicing the slavery thing. The New England states were moving away from it, but they would benefit from slavery because of transportation, because of insurance, and because of banking and financing, right? But in the South, slavery was the basis of their economic survival. So you're sitting down with this group of dudes, you're going to start a new country, and you already got some deep differences about what type of economy is going to shape and mold and expand your nation, right? So if we could go back and look at this, we would have told them up front, number one, stop stealing the indigenous people's land, stop killing them, strike deals, strike bargains with them that don't involve violence. Number two, stop importing and enslaving Africans. And number three, you guys got to make some choices and make some decisions about your means of production and your mode of production. If you don't, guess what's going to happen? Less than 100 years from now, you're going to have a major civil war. And that's exactly what happened. They had a major civil war between 1861 and 1865 that, interestingly, if you dig deep, you find that the granddaughters and grandsons of people who had fought in the Revolutionary War to free themselves from British tyranny were now engaged in the war, fighting and killing each other. So we get the New England, the Mid-Atlantic, the Southern states, the history of political and economic tensions among the colonies and states, agricultural-based versus industrial-based economy, plantations versus factories. And what was keeping those factories going was the insistence that America be a white nation, right? I mean, they don't talk about it too much in the classrooms, but that's what it was about. They were insistent that America be a white nation. And so they were open to immigrants coming from places from Europe. Mostly, and here's the thing, not just all European immigrants were welcome. See, now here's the other thing about being white in this country. Being white in this country was not a universal thing that we, like what we see today. For example, the Irish were not looked upon as white. Neither were a lot of the Southern Italians, right? Neither were a lot of the Eastern Europeans. That was a gradual thing for them. They gradually were accepted into white America. But that's a whole different discussion we can get into later on. So you have an agricultural-based economy versus an industrial-based economy, i.e. plantations versus factories. we get the westward expansion, slave state versus free states. We talked about that before. Missouri, 1820, and Texas, 1845, were admitted as slave states. The Dred Scott decision, which is very important. Property rights of those in the territories. What was the property right? Because the Dred Scott decision was a property right case fundamentally. We look at it today like it was a civil rights case. In the 19th century, it wasn't a civil rights issue, it was a property issue. Was Dred Scott still the property? Or was he not the property because he found his way, he had escaped and found his way into free territory? That was the issue. And that was one of the most decisive cases that led to the Civil War. And the turning point was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. The Republican Party had newly formed. It was elements of some other political parties, and people can do the research and people can correct me if you know the answer now. I think it was the Whig Party and maybe a couple other political parties. And that's how the Republican Party was birthed. That's how it was born. And it came to be known as a party that was opposed to slavery. So it became a party that was associated with the abolition of slavery, with the abolitionists. And the Southern states had said clearly, and this was before and during the presidential debates. I can't remember the opposition candidate to Lincoln. His name was Stephen something. But the people from the South had said then, when they were having these presidential debates, much like the presidential debates today, except it wasn't live on TV or radio, they would travel from city to city. And a lot of Southern states had threatened succession, that if Lincoln became the president, they would succeed or they would withdraw from the United States of America. And that's exactly what happened. Lincoln became president in 1860. In 1861, there was succession in the formation of the CSA, which is the Confederate States of America. South Carolina led the charge. Again, the importance of South Carolina, pivotal. One of the main ports for captured Africans to become enslaved Africans was in South Carolina. There may have been several ports in South Carolina or gateways, but South Carolina was very important because they were the first state to openly secede from the United States of America. And then other states joined. They formed the Confederate States of America in 1861. And then there was a series of compromises that were presented by Lincoln. Lincoln, for example, he did everything he could to avoid civil war. And a lot of people think that the Civil War was about the issue of freeing the slaves. It wasn't. The Civil War was about the succession of the South from the Union, and that Lincoln, he saw his duty as the president was to save the Union and keep the Union intact at all costs. And if that meant fighting against the Confederates for whatever reason, Civil War, inflation, whatever, then that's what he was committed to do. And but he offered some compromising positions. He even offered to extend slavery, right? That, okay, well, what about you just maintain slavery for 5 or 10 more years? And they rejected that. Well, what about you guys can hold on to your slaves, but if we move westward, they could be free. They rejected that. Well, what about you guys who got the big plantations? What about you free half of your slaves? What about that? They rejected that. So all the things that Lincoln offered as a compromise to maintain the Union, they rejected. And that's finally, what led to the breakout civil war between the so-called North and South. The Blacks, or New Africans, as we now call ourselves, their fight for freedom involved 160,000 ex-slaves and 40,000 freedmen and freed women. I would suggest that if you haven't seen the movie, watch the movie Glory. Glory, I think, is one of the greatest films ever made. That's my personal opinion. My children laugh at me when I say that, especially one of my sons, because he's like into, the movie industry, film production, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's one of the greatest films ever made, not just because of the story it tells about the 54th Massachusetts, but the historical backdrop and how this regiment was received by the Black community in the North and how it was perceived and received by the enslaved Blacks in the South. And I think it tells a story of the limitations of the Civil War and the possibilities, what could have happened if the Civil War had really been about the freeing of slavery, and if Reconstruction had not been dismantled. So if you get a chance, watch Glory. And if you've seen it once, see it again. Okay. Any questions or commentary about this part? Because we're probably going to run a little over, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know this is a holiday, a holy day for a lot of us, and I want you and your family to experience Juneteenth. Any other questions or comments as we move on? Okay. If not, and I think now, yeah, so let's talk about the Freedmen's Bureau quickly. It was established to assist the newly freed slaves by locating families, housing, education, integration into civil society. I just want to make a comment about this, that second point, locating families. You know, Black men have taken a beating over the years about not being responsible, not not being good fathers, and so forth and so on. And some of that is not without some value, right? I think that universally, I think is incorrect, but I think we have some things that we need to improve on, right? Including myself. But here's the thing that may surprise a lot of you to know that as the Civil War was coming to an end, and after it ended, in particularly, which, by the way, let me go back again. Black people freed themselves during the Civil War, not just those who were on the front lines fighting, but a lot of Black people, they walked off the damn plantation, literally. They ran or they walked off, especially as the war was winding down. They saw an opportunity. The master was out there fighting. And so, brothers and sisters were grabbing their belongings, grabbing their children, and running for life, right? And it had an impact on the Southern economy, which meant that they were struggling to feed their soldiers and feed themselves because it was the Black labor force, the enslaved Black labor force, that was the backbone behind that. So Blacks were freeing themselves. They were walking off of plantations, running off of plantations. They were burning mansions. They were sabotaging the local economy in the South, right? Because it was a war-based economy at that point. There was rationing going on. So enslaved Blacks were doing everything they could to disrupt that, and some were just literally leaving it and walking and trying to find their way to the north or find their way to the west. But here's the thing that may surprise a lot of people. After the Civil War came to an end, you know what a lot of brothers were doing? A lot of brothers were actually running around trying to find their wives and their children. A lot of the freed male slaves were running around trying to locate their wives and their children, because in many instances, especially those that have been a little older, they have been separated. It wasn't uncommon for a larger plantation owner to buy out a smaller plantation owner, and the slaves would be part of that sale. Or it wasn't, and this is something that some academics have pointed out. I'm not the first person to point this out, but if you understand some of the fundamentals of capitalism in terms of capital and labor, but one of the inherent contradictions of slavery, especially for enslaved Africans, is that we were both the capital and the labor. So Black people's bodies were used as labor, but our bodies were used to capitalize different ventures as well. So the small farmer, the small plantation owner, would go to the bank and basically take out a loan. And what would be the basis for the loan was the fact that he had 5 slaves. And so the bank would give him a loan with the understanding that if he defaulted on the loan, then those slaves would become under the ownership of the bank or the finance company. People would also take out insurance policies on their slaves, right? And so we were both the labor and the capital. If you understand how bizarre and crazy that is when you deal with the fundamentals of capitalism as an economic model and system. That's why we don't want to embrace capitalism. That stuff is bizarre and crazy. It makes a lot of money for a handful of people, and the vast majority of people continue to suffer. But I just want to point that out, that a lot of men, for example, were either saving up money to go buy the freedom for their children and for their wives. And after the war came to an end, they were trying to find their children, find their wives, and relocate. That's why so many families, we have the great migrations I argue that it wasn't just one great migration, we had three. We had the first great migration as slavery was winding down and people were leaving the plantations, walking, running, sabotaging, burning, looting, doing what they had to do. And then after the war came to an end, that period is the first Black migration. The second one is after World War One, and we all know the next one is after World War Two, where many people migrated and they populated cities like Pittsburgh and Philly and New York and so forth and so on, and they moved to the West as well. So I think about within the Black Panther Party, Bobby Seale's family came from out of Texas, and Huey Newton's family came from out of Louisiana. Bobby Seale was born not in Oakland, California. He was born in Texas. Huey Newton was born in Louisiana, right? He was named Huey after who? The governor, Huey Long, down in Louisiana. So those are the kind of things I just want to throw out there real quick. The Freedmen's Bureau operated from 1865 to 1872. It was a federal agency. It was under the authority of the War Department, and it was part of the Reconstruction era. So Black Reconstruction established to reconstruct the war-torn states of the former Confederate States of America. That may sound kind of foreign, but think about the end of World War II, where you had the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan involved the reconstruction of war-torn Europe, and not just war-torn Europe that were part of the Allied territory, but the enemy's territory. The Marshall Plan helped to reconstruct West Germany. The Marshall Plan helped to reconstruct Japan, right? So this is kind of what the United States was into. Now in the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century and the 21st century, these so-called Marshall Plans, these so-called Reconstruction Plans take a different character because they involve the reconstruction of foreign entities in their particular land who may continue to be hostile. And it has nothing to do with helping to create a new nation state as it does with helping to pillage those areas' resources, their oil, their gas, their minerals, their water. That's what it's about now. So it's not about trying to rebuild a Germany or rebuild a Japan that would kind of mimic the United States of America. It's not about that anymore because corporations have taken over foreign policy. It's about fattening the pocket of the corporations to make sure that they have the room and the space to exploit the natural resources of Iraq, of Libya, and what they would like to do is Iran as well. So the Black Reconstruction established to integrate the former slaves of the South into a new political and social infrastructure. It required political and military support from the federal government. Don't forget that point, it's very important. Required political and military support from the federal government, which at that point, the federal government was ran by what political party? It's ran by the party that was victorious, the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was assassinated, but then Andrew Johnson took over. When Andrew Johnson took over, he had been Lincoln's vice president. When he took over, it became a little more difficult because Johnson was sympathetic to the Confederacy. Political and economic threat, it was political and economic threat, Black Reconstruction was, to white supremacy and slave-based social systems. So it wasn't just an economic and political threat, it was a social threat because it challenged and sought to dismantle this whole notion of white superiority versus Black inferiority. That Black people didn't have to bow and scrape, Black people didn't have to step to the side for white people, that kind of stuff. Election and appointment of multiple Black or new African public officials. That's another thing. Do the study, do the research. You'll see that you'll find out that during the period of Black Reconstruction, a lot of Blacks were able to run for public office. So it wasn't just about voting. And here's the key, folks, because if you look at what's being promoted in a lot of our communities, get out the vote, get out the vote, get out the vote. Almost like we should think about who we should be voting for. Who are these people? Whose interests do they really represent? Well, originally, it wasn't just about get out the vote. It was about run for office, get political appointments, self-determination. You're a newly liberated former slave. You need to have some power, not just about voting for someone. Get out and run for office. Look amongst yourselves, amongst you, who is best qualified to represent your neighborhood, your community, your former plantation, right? That's the person you should be voting for. There was a violent reaction of racist and fearful whites, hence we get the development of the KKK a little later on. And most importantly, we get the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877. What is the Hayes-Tilden Compromise? I'll make it quick. Rutherford B. Hayes had aspirations of becoming the next president. He was the Republican Party's nominee. Another gentleman, I can't remember his first name, Tilden, was representing the other side. And we know about, what's that process called? Where they have like electors in different states. Somebody can help me out. I kind of forget it. It's escaping my memory. We still use, oh yeah, the Electoral College. There it is. So, and in order for the Republicans to win the majority, because it was deadlocked, then the Republican Party made a compromise. It became known as the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. So what happened? The Democrats and those Confederate affiliated parties, Southern entities, they agreed that they would give their electoral college votes to Rutherford B. Hayes in order for him to win if the federal government agreed to do what? Withdraw the troops from the South. And that was the beginning of that whole mess as far as the reestablishment and the further like expansion of what we came to know as Jim Crow, the suppression of Black political freedom, in some instances, the erasure of Black political freedom. For example, in Wilmington, North Carolina, they basically got to the point where they ran out of town. The ones they didn't murder and kill, they ran out. It was a coalition of Republicans. Now, I know it sounds strange to hear this when the Republican Party was a progressive party. They were against slavery type of party. Not all of them, but many of them were. And they supported Reconstruction. In Wilmington, North Carolina, please look it up for yourself, do the research. I don't remember all the facts and figures. But in the pushback, they actually went to war against the coalition of Black elected officials and white elected officials that represented the Republican Party. They did the same thing down in New Orleans, right? So it was during this period that you get a lot of this pushback, very similar to what we're going through today. You get a lot of this pushback, but it really was amplified because of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. The Republican Party agreed to withdraw the federal troops, which meant they agreed to withdraw that political and military support, right? And that was so important to maintain and to expand Black Reconstruction. Okay, last but certainly not least, we get the response to a lot of this stuff that's going on. We get the lynchings and all that, you all know about that. We get Sister Ida B. Wells Barnett and the anti-lynching movement. She was born into slavery. She was born in 1862 as a slave in Mississippi. Her parents passed away. She took on the responsibility of parenting and providing for her surviving siblings. She dropped out of college in order to work as a teacher in an elementary school. She moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1883. She started writing for local newspapers. And in 1884, she refused to give up her seat on the train. She was physically removed and filed a lawsuit against the railroad. So again, courageous Black women. We talk about Rosa Parks in the 20th century. Let's look at Ida B. Wells, right, in the latter part of the 19th century. And then we can move here. I'm trying to move a little quickly, and please forgive me, only because I want to try to keep us on point as much as we can. Upon the lynching and murder of 3 friends, she became an advocate and organizer for the anti-lynching movement, and she traveled extensively throughout the United States and Europe, lecturing and advocating for the end of lynching. She did research, she did documentation, and wrote about the conditions and circumstances of lynching, particularly throughout the Southern United States. She was a militant activist and proponent of self-defense against racist violence. She advocated and she was known to carry a gun. So Ida B. Wells wasn't just the person who talked the talk, she walked the walk. She was a strong advocate for women's rights and a leading suffragette, which meant that she believed in the equality of women. It wasn't just about abolishing slavery. It was about elevating women so women could run for political office, so women could have a voice, so women be able to lead these different organizations and movements. Suffragettes were those women who were advocates on behalf of women's right to vote, right? If you want to look at one of the inherent and glaring contradictions, even with the abolition of slavery, well, okay, so you get the abolition of slavery or the abolition of chattel slavery, you get the Emancipation Proclamation, which, by the way, was a political ploy. It didn't free all enslaved blacks. It didn't free anybody. It was just it was a statement that Lincoln made. It was a political ploy. It was propaganda. We would call it propaganda today, and it was great propaganda. It was quite efficient. But even with the end of the Civil War and the legal ending of chattel slavery, Black women couldn't vote, right? Now, think about that. They had been on the plantations with the brothers. They had worked in the field side by side. They had been forced, right, to bear children for the slave master. Many Black women had been raped and tortured and forced to bear children for the slave master, but they still did not have the right to vote, right? After all of that. So Sister Ida B. Wells Barnett, she was a suffragette, not just on behalf of women in general, but particularly Black women. She was one of the founding members of the NAACP. Now, I know for some of us today, especially the younger people, the NAACP doesn't really resonate with you that much. But for real, back in the day, if you were experiencing serious racial discrimination, if you were a victim, your family may have been a victim of racist violence, lynching, or bombing, anything, the NAACP was an organization you wanted to have on your side. It was a very forceful, mass mobilizing type of organization. And later on, they developed a legal advocacy wing, which became a separate organization in its own right. That's the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She was a contemporary and a critic. Now think about Sister Ida B. Wells, how powerful she was. She was a contemporary of Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Marcus Garvey. But not only did she live during their era, she worked with all of these brothers, and she was a critic of every last one of them. She criticized every last one of them for their failures to do something that she thought they should have been doing. She didn't shy away from being a critic of Douglass, Du Bois, Washington, or Marcus Garvey. So we're going to move, before we end, is there any contributing commentary before we close down for this afternoon? And I really appreciate you all hanging in there. I know we're a little over. I'm gonna look in the chat and see some things here. In the meantime, is any other commentary, any narrative?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that a lot of these financial institutions, they funded slavery, like Chase, Bank of America, people, Black folks should try to not use their cards, their credit cards, or have any dealings with them.
All right. It's a good point. It's a good point. I'm just looking through some of the commentary. Okay, yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I really appreciate the comments that you all have made. I just want to highlight a few things. Sister Chandra, she's a member of our party, New Afrikan Independence Party, and she just wanted to point out she's very active in prison work for prisoner human rights and trying to end solitary confinement, which she has been for several years. And she have a project that now is under the Abolitionist Law Center, which is an organization that has been liberating prisoners and some of our political prisoners as well. And I just want to say thank you for your attendance, especially to some of my longtime friends and sisters and comrades, Sister Yasmin, Sister Tamika as well. And Sister Tamika said there was an organized effort against Ed. He spoke out against war in the Gaza, supported Palestinian students. She's talking about Mayor Ed Gainey, who protested others. Also, follow the money, very true. Tamika also writes, Pittsburgh is the up south that Malcolm used to talk about. You're absolutely right. Jennifer from out of Minnesota, she noted that the Democrats from out of Minnesota, they have a particular group, the Minnesota DFL, they ran out of money and will not be endorsing candidates for the nonpartisan elections like mayor. Currently, the Black male Democrat school board and city council in St. Paul and Minneapolis. So there's some struggles there. And thank you for your comments, Sister Tamika. Appreciate it. I'm trying to do the best I can. Okay, so we want to wrap it up. I left this part blank in terms of local connections and movements. You can think about, add in whatever is most important for you, whatever part of the country you live in or come from. And these are some recommended readings. Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Africa is a great book to read. Malcolm X himself studied this book. It's a great book. We used to read it and study it within other movements, the Black Panther Party, I'm sure the Congress of African People as well. The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass is a great book. Frederick Douglass, I think, had 2 different autobiographies, maybe just one. I don't remember, but this is definitely one you want to check out. The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois and other people have echoed this. Du Bois, whether we agree completely with his politics, especially in his earlier years, in his latter years, he became a bona fide Pan-Africanist and socialist. And he had been a critic of Marcus Garvey, but in his latter years, he recanted much of his criticism and kind of like apologized for it. But other people have said what I'm about to say, is that W.E.B. Du Bois was not just the greatest Black intellectual of his era, he was probably the greatest intellectual, period. Black, white, brown, red. He was probably the greatest intellectual, period, of his era. I think a lot of people underestimate him. I'll tell you a quick and fast story. We all know he had a PhD. He qualified for a second PhD, but because he had arrived and he fulfilled all the requirements so quickly, they refused to give it to him. This brother was a brilliant brother. And again, just because you're great and you're brilliant and you're intellectual doesn't mean you're always on the right page politically or historically. And that was the case with Du Bois. But again, Black Reconstruction is a good book to read to give you some deep, penetrating insight into what was happening and what happened during this era. Ida B. Wells and the Anti-Lynching Movement is a great book. And last but not least, 100 Years of Lynching. I read this book when I was a teenager, right? And I started reading it when I was actively involved in the Black Panther Party on the street. And then after I was incarcerated, we used to have our study groups amongst political prisoners and prisoners of war, and we would read it even then. It was a great book. And then there was a book with a tour, and the tour came through Pittsburgh. I think some of us who on this call may remember this. It was called Without Sanctuary, and it profiled the U.S. history of lynching. And here's something to think about. We talk about the lynching of Black people, but there were 2 other groups that rated second and third in terms of how they would lynch throughout this country, especially throughout the South. Reflect on what I said much earlier during the presentation about whiteness and how everybody from Europe was not looked upon as white, and how every European was not as welcome to the United States as some Europeans were. Most of the European stock that was always welcomed came from Northern Europe and Western Europe. Southern Europeans, even though Columbus was credited with founding this area, but Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans were not as welcome. And they were looked upon as like the scum of Europe or secondary or tertiary European citizens. Without Sanctuary makes it clear, and even 100 Years of Lynching says something about it, but Without Sanctuary really, and when you study beyond 100 Years of Lynching and Without Sanctuary, what you find is that the 2 other most popular groups most likely to be lynched were Italians and Jews. So give that some thought as we close out for the day. Any closing comments as we close out?
Yes, just stay safe. This political violence isn't restricted to just one area.
Right, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When's the next meeting, bro? When's the next PE?
Next PE session is going to be in 2 weeks from now.
2 weeks, same time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, same time. And I'm sorry, I really apologize for going over. But any other closing comments? And I'm going to shut this down. I'm going to do the stop share real quick. So we have any closing comments from anyone? before we end for this evening, or end for this afternoon, rather. All right. Well, thank you again. I want to remind people, again, the next PE class, the next community organizing session will be in 2 weeks. We have a set agenda. We try to stick to it for the most part. Sometimes we go off a little bit. If you want to get an idea in terms of what the curriculum looks like, you can go to our website. And let me see if I can pull this up for you. Just give me a moment. I'm going to put it in the chat. There's so much going on today. And a lot of the younger people, what I sense from them is some fear and some anxiety. Because for many of us on this call, for example, we've been through this kind of stuff before, especially those of us who come through civil rights movement, Black Power, Black Liberation movement. We've seen what this looks like. You know, we lived through COINTELPRO, so we know what it means. But for a lot of the younger people, especially the activist community, the radical revolutionary community, this is kind of a new thing for them. And they're going to need some guidance, and they're going to have to dig deep for some courage, much in the same way that we did, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So I'm going to put this on the screen. Just give me a moment. It's a section on our webpage called Membership and Organization. It's for people who want to join. But if you scroll down, a little further down, what you can pick up is our curriculum. And so we covered from slave revolts to the anti-lynching movement. Last week, we had moved up electoral politics and Black New African liberation. So the next time we're going to be talking about the period from Black migrations to Robert F. Williams. Robert F. Williams being the president of the Monroe, North Carolina chapter of the NAACP, who came into conflict with the national office of the NAACP because Robert Williams, his chapter, they advocated and practiced self-defense. Eventually, Robert Williams and his wife, Mabel Williams, they had to flee the country. They sought political asylum in China, and they stayed in China for several years. They wind up coming back to the United States. And then at some point, I don't want to spoil the presentation, so I'm gonna stop there. I think you find it to be a very good and informative presentation that resonates with some of the contemporary struggles and the movements that we belong to. So let me put this stuff in the chat real quick, and we can start to close out. All right, so there's the link to the membership and organization page. If you want to join, you're more than welcome to join. But if you could scroll down and you could see the information for the curriculum, so you can get a sense of what to expect every 2 weeks as we move forward. I also want to remind people, the National Black Radical Political Congress, we have a national convention scheduled for October the 25th and the 26th in Philadelphia at Temple University. It would be good if you all could attend, especially the people from Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. Think about what it might take to organize and get a little contingent of people to get in a van and make the trip over to Philly. All right, love you all. Take care of yourself. Power to the people, free the land, and free all political prisoners.
Power to the people, free the land, and free all political prisoners.